Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe. Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
Hello again, everybody. This is the Coach Shannon Griffith here on the Hoosier Football Tailgate on the Believe Network. I welcome you to this evening. Talk a little spring ball as the Hoosiers have gotten 3 practices in thus far and getting ready to disperse on spring break and enjoy themselves some time away from campus. And I wish those that are traveling be careful, be safe in your travels, and be smart as they head away from campus. And then when the Hoosiers get back, they'll start hitting it up again. We'll talk about the schedule here in just a moment. Again, want to thank our sponsors for tonight's show, one being Quick Cut Sports Analyst Book, video software that's used by the college football teams, high school football teams. I utilize it in my video software stuff, but it's a very, very good and very high-tech video-based software system that allows coaches and players to study the game at a high level. Also want to thank Bet Online for their continued sponsorship of the Hoosier Football Tailgate. Remember, Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for all things sports betting and all the madness that's upon us with the NCAA tournaments shortly approaching. Whether you're a seasoned fan or a first-time bettor, Bet Online is the ultimate game day companion with the largest selection of odds on everything from college basketball to $200,000 bracket contest. Sign me up. Bet Online continues to be the number one sports betting source. From every Cinderella story to every hat trick, Bet Online has you covered with all the odds, stats, and more for every game and every play and every win. Bet Online, the game starts here. And like I said, sign me up for the 200,000 bracket challenge there at Bet Online. I could use a couple bucks in the old pocket these days, but thank them again for their continue to follow me here and support us here on Hoosier Football Tailgate on Believe. And I tell you that the Hoosiers have gotten off to a great start with the weather for spring ball. They've had beautiful weather there in Bloomington, and you cannot beat the fact that you're able to go outside thus far for 3 straight practices. And then not sure Coach Signetti wants to let them go on spring break with all this weather that they have had and wants to keep them and let them practice a little bit more. But in terms of trying to get things done and accomplished in the spring setting, because it's such a short window, Coach Signetti doesn't utilize all the practice opportunities. It's sure nice that they can go out and get their reps in during these first few days of the camp, spring ball, out in the sun and not have to worry about trying to adjust and adapt for the weather and such. But very, very good start to a lot of new Hoosiers here at Indiana. And, we'll talk a little bit about that as when Zach Browning joins us here in about 10 minutes to talk about spring football, what it all is encompassing, what do the Hoosiers need to have accomplished by the end of it, and who are some of those new faces that Indiana fans should be aware of. I'll say one right now, Tyler Morris, the kid from Michigan. I think he's dynamic, and I do think he adds an element that Indiana didn't have at the wide receiver position last year, and that's top-end speed. So there's some things there, and as well as who may step into the rotation, because there's other receivers that are looking for time at the wide receiver position. Also, spring game, excuse me, having some issues there, I guess. But the spring game is been moved to that Thursday now, April 17th. That's a Thursday night from the Saturday, the 19th. I'm not sure the reasoning behind all that is, but for that simple purpose, that's kind of the way it has been with this dynamic of them having to move this game to a Thursday night, and I'm not sure we will know all the dynamics. So they're going to do their spring game on the 17th, Thursday, and I do believe they still will have one practice after that on Saturday to finish everything up for that purposes of getting their opportunities to get all their offense and defense stuff in prior to ending spring ball, and then right into spring recruiting and the players getting ready to address any finals that are upon them that final probably week there. And the next thing you know, we're into summer and we're talking about the season starting in a couple months. So things will go fast here. And we're, before you know it, we'll be talking about summer and the summer camp will be approaching in the latter months of July. I found something that I thought was interesting that was being talked about in the news of late, and it goes back to these NIL scenarios and how each state is going to adopt them when it comes to these things. In Utah has put legislation on the docket and it's passed that will allow their schools to directly pay their athletes with NIL for NIL money. Now, the dynamic there is it's not any NIL scenario is supposed to be handled on the outside of the institution. This is something that each school was wanting to have done, where the schools would have some control over it. And Utah has kind of taken care of that in the legislation of their state. And I don't know what that means for all the other institutions that are wanting that same thing to be able to have their hands in on NIL money distribution. So that will be an interesting one to watch as it comes up. And then out in Colorado, they are now putting legislation up for a vote that would forbid NIL disclosure on the monies that are to be disclosed on what someone is or isn't making it a true private thing and no transparency. And I'm not quite sure how I feel on that. I feel for the one side of the coin in protecting whatever athlete, also protecting, the camaraderie of the program. If so-and-so is making X amount of dollars and the other top player is not making similar or more, could cause a problem. But right now, it looks like Colorado will institute that law, making NIL money not easily accessible to the general public, which will have an issue with transparency. And I'm not quite sure how that will all play out in Colorado. And then you got to feel for what it may mean for the rest of the league. I know not everything with NIL was put out in a situation like that, where you could see this year somebody getting X amount of dollars from NIL money, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. But those are two court cases I found very interesting, how it directly impacts the NIL and everything that's associated with it. And we'll have to keep an eye on all that. And remember, the basic settlement lawsuit has still yet to be ratified. And Congress has already started bringing in a panel. Nick Saban has been to Washington twice to serve on a panel. We're talking specifically about athletes being paid as well as NIL money and things of that nature. I don't know if anybody saw this the other day, but Paul Feinbaum, one of the biggest, what's out there in the land when it comes to things of NCAA football wise, and his love and admiration for the SEC and nobody else, had a couple quotes, and I'm trying to find it here real quick if I can. Let's see if it's up here. That's not there. Let's go back up here and see if it's in one of these. Well, I had it. Doesn't mean it just has me at this point in time. Let's see if we can find some of it as well. But essentially, what it came down to was Paul Feinbaum basically called Indiana a paper tiger last year in the Big Ten. And it wasn't something that Indiana fans, for that much, took a little bit as exception of calling Indiana a paper tiger in the world of college football last year, almost calling it a fluke on what Indiana did last year. It's let's see here if I got it. That way we can see it a little bit better and see if I can bring it into, say, picture here. We'll try to do it that way. Let's see here. That's the spring. We'll come back to that. And let's see if this comes up here. Yeah, there we go. There's a little bit of it. Let's see if I can blow it up here because it does warrant further discussion here on everything and anything. But you can kind of see the gist of it here, hopefully. Let's see if we can do it a little bit more. But essentially what happened was Paul Feinbaum stated something to the effect, there are essentially three schools making noise in the Big Ten, Feinbaum said via Athlon Sports. I don't count Indiana. Indiana, to me, was a paper tiger. You have Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State. Those are the three teams in the Big Ten. He even didn't even include Oregon in that into the equation, if you want to be honest. Although I have to believe it to see it, is a factor this year, and that is the reference to the Penn State side of the coin with all that. So Mr. Feinbaum basically doesn't think Coach Cignetti and the Hoosiers are anything but a one-hit wonder in what he was discussing when it comes to things of that nature from last year. And then, of course, Coach Cignetti gave his response, and it's a typical response from Sig that you would expect to see. Nothing overshadowing or negative in nature from that perspective. Let's let it bloom up here. Talks about coach entering his second year, players returning having a chip on the shoulder and something to prove that last season wasn't a fluke. Cignetti says, but look, this football team that didn't finish the season very well. We went up and played in the college football playoffs and didn't play like we want to. Mr. Paul Feinbaum and the paper tiger quote that made its way back to Indiana's campuses, and therefore, I wanted to get that out there as it pertains to the Hoosiers and things of that nature. But it was one of those things that kind of caught me a little off guard with everything that he would make that sort of statement. But I guess in some respects, it's not to be a surprise either. Quickly, the spring ball schedule for Indiana. Of course, the 13th was the last practice before they go off for about a week to 10 days. They don't come back to practice until 2 weeks from today. The last two practices in the month of March, and then you can see the April there, basically a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday type of schedule, and it's one of those things. While the Indiana Hoosiers practice mostly in the morning, if you can get out, and they do have an open practice, and you can probably find out what that entails with everyone there on campus to see when practices are open for public consumption, so to speak. If you want to get out and watch a practice, I encourage you to do that. I think it gives you a unique perspective of watching things more broken down into different phases of a game and doing different things from just going out and putting 22 guys out on the field and having at it. So if you can do that, it'd be great. Remember the spring game 17th, that's moved to the 17th, and let's hope that we have a pretty good turnout. It's kind of hard to get a great turnout on a those nights, weekday nights, as everything all of a sudden gets taken up. And I'm going to try to bring my man Zach Browning into the equation. Let's see here. There he is. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I got you.
Okay, and I've got you, and anybody in the chat, let me know if there's any echoing, as it's not on our end as of right now, or I can't hear of anything. So we'll assume that we are doing things in a manner that is kosher to the viewing audience out there. But Zach, I appreciate you coming on today. I know that you were up in Indy for the basketball game this afternoon, and although we are a football dominating topic of discussion, the Hoosiers kind of went out the way that they've played in some games this year, where it was a no contest and a lot of guys that weren't hitting shots.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it was a situation where Indiana kind of needed a win and didn't get the win that they needed. It's kind of something that has been plaguing Indiana really for the last, not only this season, but last couple of seasons now under Mike Woodson. Indiana had a chance to really solidify their NCAA tournament hopes, and they were unable to do it today.
Yeah, and Oregon kind of used a big run like they did a few weeks ago out in Oregon, where they got about a 16, 18-point run. It really separated Oregon from Indiana, and Indiana, boy, they just couldn't get any shots, especially Luke Goody. He struggled mightily today. I thought it was not a great performance for him, because he just missed a lot of shots that he normally hits.
Yeah, Luke Goody was uncharacteristic today. He talked a little bit after the game about hoping that this season wasn't over, because obviously there's questions on whether or not he can get that medical redshirt waiver to come back for next season. So it was kind of a weird vibe, not only with Luke Goody, but with the entire team. It's one of those situations where we don't really know if their season is over. They could still continue, or that could be the last time we see Mike Woodson as the Indiana head coach. So it's a weird vibe. It was a weird vibe around the locker room, a weird vibe around the team after the game, because there's a lot of uncertainty revolving around Indiana and their NCAA tournament hopes right now.
Yeah. Personally feel that they will not make it into the field. I know some people talk about them maybe going into the play-in games as a possibility. I just don't think they've played good enough basketball, even in the second half. They've had some spurts, but anyway, we'll talk about that another day for a basketball conversation. We're here to talk Indiana spring football, and I know that you've had some time to be out there for a couple of their practices already and talk to some guys as well. What have been some things for you in your observational aspect of practice thus far, being out there on the stadium practice in the practice field?
Something that probably the biggest thing is just the fact that coming off of last season, the success that Indiana had last season, there's not really much that has changed. Despite the success, despite maybe some more eyes nationally on this Indiana football team, despite some expectations being raised and being higher, this is still the same team that went about things the way they did last year. We walked in, Kurt Signetti was out there, business as usual, strict timing, everything was on a time. They didn't practice for too long, an hour and a half, upwards like 2 hours, 2 hours and 15 minutes in terms of how long they practiced. Guys have said that this year has gone a little bit smoother. I know we talked to Elijah Surratt after practice, the first spring practice earlier this week, and he said that he definitely feels as though things have gone a lot smoother this go around, because last year it was kind of like the JMU guys were coming in and getting everybody acclimated. Now it's not only the former JMU guys, but the guys that were here last year, and the returners that are kind of helping get some of the younger guys and some of the transfers acclimated. So Elijah Surratt definitely said that it's been a smoother transition into spring football this season, and we'll see if that translates into a smoother spring and then a smoother fall, and we'll see how Indiana opens the season once that time comes around.
Yeah, I know Coach Signetti kind of addressed this after the first practice, and I know that sometimes press conferences after the first day of you running around in underwear, you pound your chest a little bit and think you've got a national championship team because you're not tackling anybody and you're running around in your pajamas. But I think one thing that kind of stuck out to me in his comments was that he felt there was a better organizational aspect of players knowing where to go, what to do, and things of that nature, where a year ago they were really having to teach that aspect of how they ran a practice. And it took the kids a couple days to really get acclimated to that style. And until that sunk in a little bit, it didn't allow guys to play at their fullest potential because they were thinking too much of just because that they wanted to do things the right way and how they wanted to do it. So he thought that was a improvement from a year ago. So to me, that just tells you, and maybe I'll get your opinion on that. To me, it shows some of your leadership, and you've got some older guys in the program, not a bunch of young guys in theory running around, although there are 14 true freshmen on campus.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just, if you think about it, last year there was 11 James Madison transfers. It was pretty much those were the guys that had familiarity last year going into the spring practice. Those were the only 11 guys on the team that had any sort of familiarity playing in a Kurt Signetti-led practice or doing something Kurt Signetti's way. Now you take that into this year, you've got the JMU guys that are still here. You've got the 30-plus returners that were here last year. So there's a lot more guys just on the team and around this program that have seen a Kurt Signetti practice and that have been through a season with Kurt Signetti and understand how Signetti likes to do things. And so I think that's really the biggest thing. You kind of see the continuity, and it's spread out more positionally as well. Last season, there was a lot of guys coming over on the defense, maybe not as many guys on the offensive side of things from JMU. Now there's a widespread and a healthy kind of mix of guys on offense and defense that have been here at Indiana with Signetti.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that, I've talked about quite a bit leading up to the spring practice component was the number of players that Indiana was going to have actually involved in this year's spring practice, because you had 14 true freshmen out of the 2025 class that had enrolled in January, which is to me a huge boost. And then add to that all the transfers. And I think they had like 41 new players joining in January in preparation for spring practice, and add that number to what they had back. They have about 80 some odd guys out on the field, which is that's a big number when you talk about position groups and stuff. And, looking at it now from just the short period of time, any of the young guys that have stood out to you or any of the guys that have transferred in that stood out that, either are knocking on the door to getting on the field or they've already walked through the door per se?
Yeah, I think just going back to again what some of the players said, I believe earlier this week when we talked to them after spring practice too. Carter Smith raved about Pat Coogan. Obviously, he was a highly touted transfer coming in from Notre Dame. Carter Smith has raved about how he's come in and really already taken a kind of leadership role within the offensive line. There's still some things to iron out there with Coogan as far as how Indiana wants things done, but Carter Smith was raving about Pat Coogan. Then you look at in that secondary, Amari Farrell. We talked to Amari Farrell. He's a returner. He raved about a couple of guys. Byron Baldwin was one of them, the highly touted four-star freshman that's come in and is already on campus. Farrell said that Baldwin's so talented, you can already tell that he's gifted as an athlete and as a skilled player. He's just got to put it together at the college level and get up to game speed really at the college level is what Farrell said. Farrell also pointed to another safety in Devon Boykin, that NC State transfer, who could be pushing for some significant playing time early in the season. He talked about Lewis Moore as well, who of course is familiar with Indiana, right, but not familiar with Kurt Cignetti's Indiana. And then with Elijah Surratt, he talked about a couple of the freshmen. One freshman that stood out, though, when we were talking with Elijah Surratt was a LeBron Bond. He's another wide receiver, another true freshman that has really stood out. I believe the words that Surratt used was lightning fast, somewhere along those lines. Yeah. He said he has blazing game-making speed, and that definitely is exactly how I would describe LeBron Bond. So there's a lot of guys that are standing out. Of course, it's still early and still a lot of improvement to be made, but there's a handful of guys, both freshmen and transfers, that are a little bit older that have stood out so far, at least in spring practice, to some of their teammates.
Yeah, and you don't want to discount what a teammate thinks of somebody as an athlete or a player, because, the reality of it is the kids know, right? They can talk about, oh, man, that guy's good, that guy's good. And when you have that type of competitiveness brought in, it actually excites the kids because they know that they're going to have to compete, work hard, but they want that. They want that competitiveness. Now, you brought up, Coogan and his ability to step in a room and instantly capture that leadership mentality, really kind of replacing Mike Kadick in the room. But here's a guy, 6'5", 310 pounds, was playing for Notre Dame in the national championship not too long ago, and now he's, walking in an offensive lineman's room taking charge, and that's kind of what he was at Notre Dame. I think that only bodes well for Coach Bobstead, because that takes a little pressure off for him. But a guy like that's going to have a lot of different experiences of what it takes to play at a high level, and bringing that into the room, but also into the team mentality. What's your thoughts on that aspect of Coogan?
Yeah, he's uber important. And it was kind of a funny moment when we were talking with Carter Smith. Obviously, Coogan made some headlines with sort of his pregame speeches that were captured on the sidelines prior to Notre Dame games, especially in that playoff run, with those speeches that were rather passionate. We'll just leave it at that. That's how he described it, those passionate speeches that Coogan led. What Carter Smith said that stuck out to me, though, was kind of just the fact that Coogan and Kadick are similar yet different. Kadick may be a little bit more of a funny kind of jokester type of guy. Coogan is a little bit not serious, but less of a jokester. I believe docile was the word that Carter Smith used. He's kind of more even-keeled. And you bring up the point of the fact that these guys know in practice when they're going up against guys. It was this time last year when the entirety of the offensive line was telling us how good Mikhail Kamara was going to be. And
Yeah,
lo and behold, Mikhail Kamara became an All-American caliber player. So you're
right.
exactly right. These guys know exactly who they're going up against in practice, and they know exactly how good these guys are.
Yeah, no question. And that's the one thing when kids see guys flash or they've been around them enough that they feel them adding some things into the program. You take the Baldwin kid for an example. Here's the kid that Indiana was on quite ferociously all early last recruiting season. He actually decommitted for a while, and I thought, man, that's a guy that they're going to lose in the grand scheme of things. And fortunately enough, they were able to get a kid like that because this is one of those things that Indiana sorely needs is to build the foundation with true Big Ten talent. I'd say that Baldwin is that type of player in the secondary that fits that build as a true freshman. Your thoughts on that aspect of it?
You're exactly right. That's kind of how you build a program. It's obviously one thing to rebuild a team in 1 year like Kurt Signetti did last year, bringing in all the transfers. He brought in a lot of transfers this season, but to truly sustain success, if you're looking at the Big Ten heavyweights like an Ohio State, a Michigan, a Penn State, it's not just the transfer portal that those types of teams really hammer and hit hard. It's the recruiting classes. You got to have those guys in on the ground floor. And Baldwin is the guy that not only is he good to kind of build that foundation for Indiana, build that kind of recruiting platform and set that baseline for the Hoosiers, but he's also going to push the veterans. He's good enough, he's talented enough and skilled enough right away that he's going to push guys like Lewis Moore. He's going to push Devon Boykin in that secondary and at that safety position to be even better themselves. I think that's really the biggest thing. Kurt Signetti talked about it after spring practice. He said there's a sizable leg up and advantage that these true freshmen have when they step onto campus in January and are with the team for spring practice, as opposed to a recruit or a kid in the
Yeah.
2025 class that might get here in the summer and only be here for fall camp before the season starts. There's that sizable advantage and sizable leg up that these guys have that are true freshmen and that are here already. By the time they get to fall camp, they'll feel like grizzled veterans, and I think Baldwin will be one of those guys that feels like that.
Yeah, and you talk about a secondary that there was some question marks after this past season on whether or not they would be able to uh, regain some of the skill that they were going to need to have, especially when they, go up top tier 10 teams in the Big Ten. And for the most part, I think they did a pretty good job in replacing some of that talent, both with incoming players and some transfers that we just talked about. The kid from North Carolina State, the young man from Pittsburgh, who will probably be at the other corner that can be also put on an island. Secondary wise, I think they've got a pretty good group of secondary and some depth there.
Yeah, I would definitely say last year, if there was a weakness defensively, it probably was the secondary. Not that it was weak by any stretch. It just wasn't as strong as that Mikhail Kamara, James Carpenter, CJ West
Right.
led defensive line, and then Fisher and Walker in that linebacker core. But this year, you talked about the Pitt transfer, Ryland Gandy, Amari Knight, drew some praise from Amari Farrell this past week. D'Angelo Pons, obviously, we know what he's about. He's going to be fine. Amari Farrell probably will lock down that rover spot. Is a spot he played well in for much of last season. Then at safety, Lewis Moore, he's been here. He's done that in the Big Ten. He was an all Big Ten caliber player 2 years ago,
Right.
then went off to Ole Miss. He played SEC football. He's going to be just fine. And then Devon Boykin, depending on how well he can come back from that injury that he sustained 2 years ago now, we'll see if he can contribute at a high level too. But this should not be a weakness by any stretch for Indiana this season. It might actually be one of the strengths, not only of the defense, but of the team.
Yeah, I think you're correct there. I think there's been an upgrade in that regard compared to where they were a year ago at this time, because they came out of spring ball with some glaring weaknesses in the secondary that they needed to address. Linebacker core, again, Aiden Fisher, getting him to come back for another year. Man, that was a huge boost for the defensive staff and what he brings to the table. And I guess the biggest question is he going to have somebody to, play beside him, because Walker's gone and he had a lot of plays last year at the linebacker spot. So can they retool that position with some guys stepping up now and getting their opportunity.
Yeah, I think that might be one of the question marks on the defense. I literally asked Aiden Fisher that point blank earlier this week. I was like, you lose Jalen Walker. Who's the next guy to step up and kind of be the next Jalen Walker? How do you kind of handle losing that type of production? Because Walker was great last season. And he pointed to a couple of guys. He said Isaiah Jones will probably be a big factor. Isaiah Jones, a redshirt junior. Elijah Hardy, a sophomore, but he played a decent amount of football last season and was rather productive in his time. Jamari Farmer, he pointed to PJ Nelson, two true freshmen that could see some playing time as well. I think the biggest issue here is the production, the skill, the talent. They might have some guys that can come close to Walker, but Walker was just such a freak athlete.
Yeah.
There's nobody that you're going to be able to find really around the Big Ten. It's a difficult guy to find around college football in general, to find a guy with the athleticism and the skilled combination of Walker. So I think that's where it might hurt Indiana a little bit there.
Yeah, exactly. And, like you said, you try to replace somebody like that, and sometimes you're just not going to get all the boxes checked. And it's nothing because pretty good ball player walked out the door. But the two gentlemen you talked about there, the thing that Indiana did with a couple of those younger guys is they did get some quality reps during the year, especially for Walker when he may have went down, and they're not just kind of unveiling a true rookie this year. They've got some guys that are lock solid that have been players and such, and I do think they'll have a pretty good core there. Now, you kind of look at then the defensive line and what was lost there, what that's been brought in. I'm not sure they lost much in the sense of what they were able to bring in and replacing them, because it seems like they may have gotten some identical players through the portal.
Yeah, of course, the big guy is back. And Mikhail Kamara, he might push for some Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year acknowledgement this season if he's going to improve upon his season last year. But you're exactly right. There's not only a combination of kind of transfers that came in and are expected to kind of handle a bigger load, but there's also some returners. You look at a guy like Tyreek Tucker, Marcus Burris, those two contributed last year a little bit along that defensive line. They're expected to come in and step up. There's a handful of freshmen, a lot of freshmen that could really contribute. A guy like Tristan Abram, a guy like Kyler Garcia. There's a lot of freshmen as well. But on the transfer front, you're looking at a guy like Hoosier Wheeler. He came in from Western Kentucky. I actually was at the NFL Combine a few weeks ago talking to a Western Kentucky defensive back about Wheeler, and he said there's never a moment that Wheeler isn't trying to get better, whether it's on the field or whether it's off the field. He said that Wheeler's 100% of the time, 24/7, aiming to get better and looking to get better. And then, of course, you've got the Texas State transfer, Dominique Ratcliffe. So this is a retooled offensive line. They might lose a little bit of talent because we've seen what CJ West has been able to do at the Combine and stuff like that with the numbers that he's put up. He's going to be a big loss. James Carpenter will as well, especially from a leadership perspective. But talent-wise, production-wise, I don't think there should be that much of a fall-off, if any, for this defensive line.
Yeah, and when you put it all together, I think, like you just said, they've addressed the needs or the concerns by losing guys to graduation, just as you spoke of, especially up front of the defensive line, and then added a strong back half defensively. That's only going to strengthen your front 6 or 7 guys up front. So I do think the defense is should have a pretty dominating force again in the Big Ten, and that's what you win with is good solid defense, and that's what Indiana was able to do last year with that defensive unit. Just playing out of their minds in some games. You just couldn't believe what the defense was able to accomplish last year in the rushing game and in the passing game, for that matter. They were highly ranked in both categories at the end of last season, and then Coach Haynes becomes a Broyles Award finalist. He didn't win it, but that's because of the group that he had on the field. Let's flip over to the offensive side of the ball. Let's talk about the $64,000 question. Fernando Mendoza, the young man from Cal that every time that Coach Signetti speaks of Fernando, he talks about the duress that he was under at at Cal, since he was on his back some 40 times. early thoughts on Fernando in terms of his stepping into that position that Curtis Rourke has vacated, and some pretty big shoes to follow.
You're exactly right. It's going to be difficult, at least in season one. The expectations are high for Mendoza. He comes in highly touted, and of course, the season that Curtis Rourke was just able to have in year one with with the Hoosiers, his only season at Indiana. So the expectations are going to be high. But I think Indiana fans, something that they're going to have to remember throughout this season watching Mendoza is that he will just be a junior. He still has another year of eligibility after this season, which is something that I think will be big for Indiana moving forward. But you can't find anybody out there, whether it's a former Cal player, whether it's somebody who's worked with him for a couple of weeks or a couple months now here at Indiana, that doesn't love Fernando Mendoza. Not only what he's able to do on the field, I mean, Miles Price and Keyshawn Williams at Pro Day were praising his ability to throw a football, praising his ability to put the ball anywhere he wants to on the football field. But then I was talking to, again, at the Combine, talking to a couple of Cal guys who were Mendoza's teammates last season, and they raved about his preparation. It was, I believe, linebacker Teddy Buchanan, linebacker at Cal last season, praised the preparation that Mendoza goes through. And I think that's something that stands out. That's something that separates him from a lot of other younger quarterbacks. Again, he's not super young, but he's also not old at the same time. He's a redshirt junior coming into this year. But I think his preparation will set him apart from some of the other quarterback transfers around the country and will really set him apart on the field once Indiana gets going.
Yeah, and we had the statement there from John about been a long time since IU can say they're reloading instead of saying rebuilding. And yeah, it's kind of a interesting dynamic that a lot of things have happened since Curt Cignetti's arrival to a program that was all but on life support, and has now put them in the national spotlight in year one, and now getting some big time recruits out of the portal and out of true freshman commitments to look at Indiana and actually come to IU, which is something, again, we talk about the foundation and how important that is with that. With Mendoza, the only thing that I see from him are two things, and I know that I think I saw something that it was talked about in one of the news conferences after the practice and such. The one thing about him, he's a 6'5" tall kid. He doesn't have a lot of meat to him. He doesn't have a lot of that physical weight aspect to it, strength and stuff, where Curtis Rourke was a pretty well-rounded individual from a physical point of view. Now, we knew what Curtis's weaknesses were after the season. He had a torn ACL. So, you got to take it a little bit of that perspective. But I do think there's still some growth Mendoza has to grow into, and one of them being into that a body that has that physical nature with him, that he can start adding on some weight. I'm not talking bad weight. I'm talking muscle weight in that regard. But you're correct. I watched some of his throws from practice as well as the pro day, and he does throw a great touch ball, down the sidelines, gets plenty of air under it. So very similar to what Curtis Rourke was able to do. I think the big question, will he be able to throw the back shoulder throw as well as Curtis Rourke did? Because that's what Indiana did well last year in pressing the ball vertically. So I do think that the one thing I think will help Indiana's offense is you got Mendoza, a kid that's a little more mobile than what Rourke was, that can elude the rush if need be and get positive yardage. But now Indiana can incorporate some things like play action boots, moving the pocket, changing the release point and things like that, where Indiana last year was predominantly drop back. And that puts, at the end of the year, when you've already shown that you're pretty much in the pocket type of team, you're going to have teams tee off on you, and Michigan, Ohio State, and Notre Dame did just that. And it makes it tough when you can't move a pocket and help the offensive lineman especially avoid just being ganged up on. And I do think that played out there at the end of the season with Indiana's inability to move the pocket, just from the standpoint Curtis had a bad bum knee. And I don't know if that's kind of what you see him being able to do, Zach, from what you saw already, but give your opinion on that aspect of him.
Yeah, first off, I think you're definitely right about his frame and his size. He's listed at 6'5", 225 pounds, but you can just tell he's got a lot more room to add muscle onto that frame. He is more mobile. He's more athletic. He's more of a run around you more than a run through you type of guy. Curtis Rourke may be a little bit different in that aspect last year, but I think something that might be a little bit underrated, and it's sort of a question mark, something I'm circling and will be focused on heading into the season, is the RPO game, because that's something that was a big strength of
Mm-hmm.
Curtis Rourke. He was great with the decision making, when to pull it out, when to fire it over the middle to Elijah Surratt. I I can't even count how many times that Rourke and Surratt made that kind of connection over the middle on that RPO game. So there's a couple things I'm looking at with that. A, does Mendoza have the decision making ability at this stage in his career, at this stage in his development, to be able to operate that as smoothly as offensive coordinator Mike Shanahan would like? Does he have that ability to run that and keep the defense honest, keep those linebackers in place with his eyes, keep those safeties from cheating up? A, can he do that? And B, can he even throw in a different wrinkle? Is there an option where maybe he's got three different options he can do? He can, when he snaps it, he can hand it off, he can keep it himself, or he can throw it over the middle. I think that might be another wrinkle Indiana can throw into that RPO game as well, that option game where Mendoza has the ability to keep the ball, not just throw it or hand it off, unlike Rourke, who was a little bit more, it was either going to be a run or it was going to be that RPO pass over the middle to Surratt. So I think Mendoza, if the decision making is as far along as Indiana is hoping it can be, I think that RPO game could be opened up, and I think it could help keep teams honest defensively and kind of help with that surviving the pressure and moving that pocket and making sure teams can't just line up and tee off, read that snap count, and kind of just come at Mendoza. I think if
Right.
he's able to show that decision making and show that he's developed there and can add a different wrinkle to that RPO game for Indiana, I think that would be massive for the Indiana offense.
Yeah, no question. I think what Mendoza already has, and listening to him speak, I do think he's a highly intelligent young man, and he does probably have the mental capacity to do exactly what you were talking about. But it does have to be matched with the physical ability. And sometimes that's where a young quarterback can get caught up a little bit because of it being a new thing. But the fact that he was at Cal and they did a lot of the similar stuff when it came to that, I do think he'll handle that quite well. His brother's in that battle. He's in the battle with Grant Wilson, another transfer quarterback that they brought in from Old Dominion, and actually played against Coach Signetti and the Bryant Haynes defense, and threw for the most yards he did against them 2 years ago. How does that kid look as well? With in that battle, because that's going to be the battle for that 2 or 3 position. Is it going to, is Alberto going to be moved up in that regard, or is Grant Wilson that heir apparent backup guy that has playing experience and they're not dropping off?
Yeah, so it was weird. It's hard to you don't want to read too much into like who you're seeing run with the ones versus the twos versus the threes in spring practice, but I will say we saw Alberto Mendoza kind of running with the twos at least a little bit so far this past week in spring practice. It was Wilson that was going with the threes mostly, but Wilson, I'd find it hard to believe that Kurt Signetti would go to a redshirt freshman in Alberto Mendoza over a redshirt senior and Grant Wilson if it were to come to that in a game where maybe Mendoza's hurt, maybe he picks up an injury for a drive and Indiana's in a tight game. I find it hard to believe that Grant Wilson wouldn't be the backup in that situation. He's got the experience. He's played college football a ton. And I think he'll be great, not only just in that kind of backup capacity, but just for the room in general. You look at this room, it is a young quarterback. And of course, Tyler Cherry isn't technically on the roster this season as he's dealing with an injury, but a guy like Cherry, a guy like Alberto Mendoza, Jacob Bell is a true freshman from Illinois. Those are guys that need a veteran voice. And even Fernando Mendoza, Mendoza's just a redshirt junior. He's not got all the experience in the world. So the valuable things, not only on the field, but off the field, that those types of guys can learn from a guy like Wilson, I think that's really where his value will be shown the most this season with Indiana.
Yeah, I agree. And not, Alberto, if there's one thing that he had going into spring is he had already been through a Kurt Signetti and a Mike Shanahan practice as well as offense. So he had a leg up on both of them in that regard. And I think in this day and age, they stopped doing year 2 and year 3 because they're all so close. They kind of worry about who's won, and then we'll decide who's that next guy in at a later date, if we need to do something like that. But yeah, I do think the one thing I do think at the quarterback room, and it's I'm glad that they got Wilson just from the standpoint you got an older guy that's played. I do think they're still a little bit short in that room in terms of bodies when it comes to surviving a Big Ten season at that position. So that's still a concern for me. When you look at this wide receiver group, they were pretty decimated in terms by the number of guys they lost via graduation. You're talking about Miles Price and Williams and, some of the other guys that were in those fill-in roles. And, the one guy that you had really that was coming back with the most experience per se is Surratt. But I think Miles Price was a heck of a pickup because I do think he has top-end speed that will add to it, as well as E.J. Williams. I think if he can stay healthy and really develop, has a chance to be a stellar wide receiver. And then some of the young cats, I do think, will find themselves in that rotation. Kind of your thoughts at the wide receiver group, because that was one position, too, that I had a big question mark because of what they lost.
Yeah, I think the receiver room will be fine this year. I think they're going to be a strong point of the team as well. Again, they lost a lot of guys, both Miles Cross and Miles Price. They lost a lot of talent there, but they got a lot of guys in the transfer portal, a lot of productive and proven guys in the transfer portal as well. And you bring back your top 2 receivers from last season in Elijah Surratt and Omar Cooper. Those two, they're still going to be fine. They're still going to be productive. Mekhi Jackson, I think, is a good transfer. I think he'll play in probably more of a slot role this season. Same with Tyler Morris from Michigan. And you talk about a guy like Morris, that's the guy who has experience playing for a national champion in Michigan just a couple of years ago. He has experience. He got a touchdown in the bowl game against Alabama this past season. He's done it against good teams. He's done it at a high level throughout his career. You look at a guy like E.J. Williams, he's got all the talent in the world. A former top 10 receiver recruit in the entire country when he committed to Clemson, 4 or 5 years now at this point, since he's a fifth-year guy. But Williams, again, as long as he can stay healthy, he's got maybe the most talent out of any receiver in the receiver room, and not to mention the fact that he's 6'4", 203 pounds, and can run like the wind as well. Williams has a lot of talent. It's all about staying healthy and staying on the field for him, which has been a problem. And then we talked earlier about LeBron Bond. I think he's going to be good, but somebody that hasn't even shown up on campus yet, he's going to be arriving in the summer, Davion Chandler, 4-star recruit out of Lawrence North. He was a big hit this offseason for Indiana on the recruiting front. I think he is got Omar Cooper written all over him. He's that kind of heir apparent, that next guy from Lawrence North. Of course, Cooper graduated from Lawrence North himself. Now Davion Chandler joining the Indiana receiving corps out of Lawrence North too. I think Chandler's got a bright career. Maybe not this year because it's a crowded receiver room with a lot of veteran talent. But I think Chandler at some point, maybe it's next year, maybe it's a couple years down the line, will have a big impact on this Indiana team. He's got that type of talent out of Lawrence North.
Couple other position groups here. The other one is running back. I mean, another position that was hit with losing Ellison and the other running back, and I'm missing his name right now. So yeah, Ellison. Lawton. There we go. I have Black on my mind because he's the only one that's really back in that group. Elijah Green transfers basically because he didn't see a way to get on the field, and he was really good. I mean, if people watch some of his mop-up duty, that kid could play, and he chose to go somewhere else. But Indiana did what Indiana does, and they find some very good other bodies to put right in there. I think they're going to be okay. But your thoughts on the running back room heading into spring ball, and then of course heading into the off season?
Yeah, it's another group that was reloaded. I mean, you look at Kalen Black; he was the number 3 running back last season for Indiana, and the fact that they got the transfers that they did, he might be forced into another RB3 type of role this season. Of course, he'll be running back by committee. Everybody will see snaps. A lot of guys will. But it's something that stood out to me specifically about Black in that running back room is that when we went for the first spring practice earlier this week, they went from their stretching into starting drill work. They were breaking it down, getting ready to break up into position groups for drill work. And it was Kalon Black that was kind of leading the charge. He was the vocal guy. He was the only guy talking. He brought everybody together, said something real quick, about 2-3 seconds, and then they all broke up. So I think Black is somebody to look out for as far as a vocal leader is concerned. I think he's a redshirt senior. He's obviously been with Kurt Signetti for forever at this point. So I think he's a guy to watch out from a vocal leadership perspective. I don't know how much of an impact he's going to have on the field because Roman Hemby and Lee Beebe are fantastic running backs. Of course, Roman Hemby at Maryland, he's done it at the Big Ten level. He's going to be fantastic. There's no question about what he can do. And then, of course, UAB transfer Lee Beebe, he's talented as well. So there's a lot of guys in that room. They can all do different things. Roman Hemby is a great pass catcher, maybe more so than the other two. Kalon Black can really get downhill and get in the trenches if you need a yard or two in a short yardage situation. So not only is there a lot of guys, it's a versatile room that can really cover for each other's weaknesses. You know, Hemby's good at one thing, maybe not at another. Well, another running back can do what Hemby is not good at. So I think this running back room will be dynamic. I think behind that offensive line, it'll be a good running back room, and I think there shouldn't be much of a drop-off, if any, maybe even an uptick in production on the ground for Indiana this season.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think Hemby gives Indiana a running back that can get the tough yardage when needed, but at the same time, he's a guy that can take a 3-yard run and break it to a 90-yard touchdown because he does have some of that top-end speed that maybe Indiana lacked last year with Lawton and Ellison. So be interesting to see. I like Keon Black. The way I saw of him last year, I thought, like you said, he was a tough downhill runner and good in situational stuff. And I think that's a room, too, that got a good boost in the arm, so to speak, with, what they were able to attract in the through the portal. And speaking of the portal, you lose a player like Zach Horton, and here's a guy that, for the most part, was more of a blocking tight end than he was a receiving tight end, although he was fairly capable, and they used him in many different ways to scheme up blocking schemes and things of that nature, so vital to what Indiana's successes were last year offensively, even though he may not have been on the stat line as much as people may have thought. I do think they got 2 really good tight ends coming in, especially the States kid out of Tennessee. Your thoughts on the tight end room?
Yeah, I do think this is one of my personal concerns heading into the season because, as you mentioned, Zach Horton was maybe a block first guy, but he was definitely a capable pass catcher, was really good pass catcher 2 years ago in his final season at James Madison. The numbers took a little bit of a drop last season at Indiana, but he was still a great pass catcher, great blocker. So he had both of those qualities in one. I think where Indiana's at now with that tight end room, they kind of have each of those qualities, but in 2 separate players. I think Riley Nowakowski out of Wisconsin, I think he's more that blocking tight end. He's more the guy that's going to be able to block not only in the run game, but in the pass game as well. So I think he's got that kind of version of Horton. I think Nowakowski is the blocker, and then Stays out of Tennessee, as you mentioned. I think he's more the pass catcher. I don't know if either of those guys are capable at doing both at the level that Horton was, but I think both of them are skilled enough to do blocking and pass catching respectively. I just don't know if they have the combination of pass blocking and run blocking and pass catching that they had a season ago in one player in Zach Horton. So that's a little bit of a concern for me, something to keep an eye on for me as Indiana heads further into spring practice as that tight end room.
And I think if that's the case, coming out of spring ball, you maybe see more true 4 wide receivers in the game than a tight end and 3 receivers, as what Indiana was traditionally last year, and that gave them a lot of flexibility in what they could get into as an offense that I think really puts the defense in a bind, because is the tight end attached? Is he unattached? Is he spread out, or is he, off the ball and can switch sides and change the strength if a matter of a few motions? So I think you're correct. That's the one spot that gives you a little bit of pause just because of what you lost. And not being able to potentially duplicate everything that was brought in with it in that regard. So, well, that's a pretty good evaluation there of what we've seen or what you have seen in the first couple of practices. It'll see if it plays out as we go along into the latter part of March and into April. You know, one last thing here before I let you go. We've already talked about recruiting, and the 25 class has come together, and all for the most part that is complete. You know, with some of the rule changes now, you're basically everyone's on a scholarship per se, and it's capped at 105 kids. That's the reason why they kind of did what they did with Cherry, because they didn't want to occupy a position with him being on the roster per se. But heading into the 2026 recruiting year, which is very right in the minute right now, because you do have some of the top kids already coming in for spring practice, and some are actually going to make their official visits as they go through the month of April, the latter part of March. Any updates in the recruiting game that you're seeing thus far that Indiana has some chances here of guys that may have come on the scene here of late?
Yeah, there's really three guys that I'm kind of looking at right now. Three guys I'm circling as big, as Indiana being big players. The first guy is one of the top guys in the Midwest in the class of 2026, four-star Jeremy Finch Jr. He's a defensive lineman out of Warren Central. He's one of the top guys, can play inside, can play outside along that defensive line. Indiana's been highly involved with him over the past couple of weeks. He's still kind of taking his recruiting process a little bit slower, but Indiana definitely a player on that front. Also on the defensive side of the ball, in the secondary, Ace Alston, he's a top 100 recruit in the class of 2027, but he's still a guy that Indiana is putting a lot of emphasis on. He's the number 2 player in the entire state of Indiana in the class of 2027. He was actually just on visit this past week. He visited practice on the 8th, and he's a big target. Indiana would love to get him. He's kind of like that Byron Baldwin type as far as he's athletic, he's talented, he's got the body for it. So, yes, class of 2027, but still a guy to keep an eye on. And then back in the class of 2026 at that quarterback position, Brady McWhorter. He's been really one of the top guys, one of the most talked about guys as of late. Indiana has had him on a couple of visits. Mississippi State's high on this guy, so is West Virginia. But McWhorter, he's visited Indiana, I believe, now 3 times this summer, at least 3 times in the calendar year of 2025. Indiana putting a lot of resources into him, pouring a lot of effort into him. They think that he can be a guy that can come in and compete right away, even as a starter, even as a guy that can compete with some of these young guys that Indiana has. But McWhorter's a guy that I'm watching at that quarterback position and seeing how that recruitment shakes up. And then just, Alston and Finch. But there's a lot of guys. Again, this 2026 class has only just begun for Indiana.
Well, I appreciate you coming on tonight, kind of giving your thoughts and about where we're at with spring ball. Although it's early, we'll get back together hopefully again as we end up the spring and see if there's anything that's changed our mind with what we're seeing with our eyes. And remember, Zach is with Indiana Rivals site, and you can catch all his stuff there as he heads into the baseball season. I'm assuming now you're probably doing a little bit of that as well, but keep abreast of also, if you're talking about recruiting, I'm sure he can pay attention to Rivals on all of that from his standpoint, and give him a follow on Twitter, because he does a lot there and talking about Indiana, not just football, but Indiana athletics as well. Zach, I appreciate your time, buddy. And now, are you going on spring break?
Well, spring break's a little bit weird because we don't know where Indiana basketball is going to go, if they're going to go anywhere. So spring break, I haven't really been able to make any concrete plans yet. So that's something we'll find out at a later date.
Yeah, the agony of being a sports journalist. Your life is bound by the team you're covering. Well, partner, I thank you for coming on. And again, we'll touch base here as we get to the latter part of the year. Okay?
Yep. Thanks for having me.
All right, buddy. We'll see you. Zach Browning from IndianaRivals.com. You can catch all his stuff there. Does a great job of evaluations. I've always felt that he's been pretty spot on, and does a pretty good job in that arena of evaluating the players on the roster, and as well as the recruiting aspect of things. He does a good job with that, and he's one of the talented guys that they have over there that's finding his way through the world of the media. And hopefully here after this year, he'll have him a spot somewhere in a full-time capacity. Well, hey, I appreciate you guys joining me here tonight. We're going to keep you abreast as much as we can with this spring calendar as the Hoosiers are on path for their spring football. Very vital point of time for them as they try to retool and also, their 2025 season will be here in a blink of an eye. And I do think they've got the talent level back in the positions they need to make a good run with all that. John wants to know, good question, what does a quality controlled coach do? Well, it used to be what quality controlled coaches really did is they were really responsible for breaking down of the opponent's game film during the week, kind of always working a week ahead and having things ready to go on a Sunday when offenses or defense started talking about the next opponent. Now these coaches, with some of the rule changes, now they can actually get on the field, whether it's a quality control coach or you see some of these now called senior offense analysis, and you're seeing some guys that head coaches are going into those roles. They're getting paid by the institution that fired them and, getting paid a little bit to make up the difference from what their buyout may have been at the previous institution. But those guys are now able to be on the field coaching. And I'm sure they utilize them in positions that have a lot of numbers at, for instance, offensive line, having an extra body to coach the offensive line, whether it be the tight ends and what they do from a run pass game. So nowadays they're a little bit more able to be utilized on the field, John, but they're vitally important. And it's usually a young guy's role, or has been, but with the rule changes now, you're seeing a lot of veteran type coaches fulfilling those roles as they're in between stops from maybe being fired the previous year, and they're just trying to stay in it, and they take a job like a quality control or offensive analysis type of position at the school that hired them for that. So, but anyway, good question. I do appreciate the activity. If you have spots and questions that you want to know, by all means, when we're here doing the Hoosier Tailgate, always welcome your comments, suggestions, and things of that magnitude. Like I said, we'll be back again next week to give you an update as we go through spring football. Of course, won't be too much to cover because of spring break, so probably going to be another week before we get back at it. Just stick to my Twitter handle at Hoosier Tailgate. I put everything up there, also on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn as well, and then my personal X account at Coach Griff 55. Got you covered with that. I want to thank everyone again for being a part of it, and hope to see you back again next time when we get together right here on the Hoosier Football Tailgate, right here on Believe.